But I want to segue into what I'm referring to as my big idea for this week, because there's been a lot of talk on the show even recently about this term of psychological safety. And where does this term come from? Well, it doesn't come from Project Aristotle, which is a Google project to understand why some teams are more successful than others, basically. What do they have in common so that we can try to be more successful? And it makes a whole lot of sense in my book. And in 2012, they embarked on this thing that they called Project Aristotle to try to figure out what was the magic, the secret sauce, etc. The interesting thing personally for me is not long after this, I ran into a person, Matt Sakaguchi, at Google. I was doing my work with a nonprofit, the Job Hackers, which some of you are familiar with. We provided the Agile MBA for over 7 years for free to thousands of people worldwide. He was in the audience, and we got to know each other. And he actually presented a time or two at our meetup in the early days, the Job Hackers meetup. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He had cancer, and there's a link to this Project Aristotle, by the way, in the comments that I put in for folks who want more information on it. But I used to joke with Matt. I used to say, you kind of spend a year out in the wilderness looking at what I call the usual suspects. It reminds me of the movie. And they started measuring things like what was the level of education of the people who were on successful teams versus unsuccessful teams? What degrees did they have? Were they introverts? Were they extroverts? How much did we pay them? What specialties did they have? How many years of experience did they have, et cetera, et cetera? These are what I call the usual suspects. Now, I learned a long time ago from reading a book called Peopleware, that when we look at developers and their ability to write good code, these things aren't that important either. There were other things that were more important. So I always told them, I said, I could have saved you a bunch of money. Not that Google needs to save a bunch of money, but I could have saved you a bunch of money, because they started to look, after a year of not finding anything, they started looking at what some of us refer to as the soft skills. And the thing that came up a lot was this term psychological safety. And psychological safety actually comes to us from Amy Edmondson. I believe she's at Harvard. She studied this. And basically it is that you're in a group where you feel like you can be yourself. This is one thing companies always talk about. And, I take it with a grain of salt, but they talk about places where you can be your authentic self. And I love that term. I wish it were true everywhere. And so you can be yourself. So you feel that you can make a contribution. You will not be ridiculed. You will not be embarrassed or punished. That's the big one, but you feel like you can speak your mind. And interestingly enough, this works really well for the VUCA world, because in the VUCA world, we need feedback in order to be successful. And it's hard to understand the things in the VUCA world. And if we get more perspectives, we get closer to the truth, if there is an objective truth. And we need the psychological safety in order to do that. So that made a lot of sense. But that's not necessarily what I would call the big idea for today, though it is a big idea. And I know Sasha is big on it, and we'll talk about that when I bring him on stage. And it is a big thing. I worked at a company where every meeting, we spent a few minutes, and some of you in the Bay Area might be familiar with this, but we spent a few minutes basically addressing psychological safety, and had a thing that the meeting organizer would read at almost every meeting of, this is a safe space. We all feel free to say what we should say, what's on our mind, et cetera, et cetera. I don't remember the exact thing. I probably should, because Lord knows I said it a few times myself. And I thought it was kind of neat that at least there was an effort to address this concept of psychological safety, and it was kind of cool. But wasn't the only thing that they found. As they started to tease through the what I would consider the more soft skills during this Project Aristotle, and started to look, and they did a bunch of surveys with people, and they asked them questions, and that's generally how you find things out about soft skills. If you want to know what's going on with somebody, just ask it, right? They found 4 other things that were correlating with the high performing teams at Google. And these things are dependability, structure and clarity, meaning and impact. And the interesting thing for me, when I look at these 4 other things, they make sense too. And I think they lead us to, I think they're very much aligned in some ways with psychological safety. If we're going to feel safe, we need to make sure that we can depend on our teammates, that they're going to keep their word. I think this is very important, by the way, that people are good with their word. I think the word would be integrity. This is something I talk a lot about with my youngest boy, is that your word is sometimes the most important thing that you have. And it's very important to make sure you keep your word, that you're dependable. Because if not, then how do you trust people? Because I think a lot of this comes down to trust. And then structure and clarity. What is my role? What are my boundaries? That actually is counterintuitive, because it sounds like, we're putting limits on people. We're not putting limits necessarily. We're saying, here's where you're safe. These are the things that you can do. And that allows us not to have to always figure out what we can and cannot do. I've worked at many places. I'm sure a lot of you out there have worked at places like this. In fact, it's probably been almost every place I've worked. So I think it's probably pretty prevalent out there, where there isn't enough structure and clarity to understand what it is that you can and cannot do. So what do you do? Well, most people are going to say, hey, I'm not going to do anything, because I'd rather do nothing and not get penalized because I overstepped my bounds than to do something and then find out later. That's the old saw of we don't ask for permission, we ask for forgiveness. Well, that gets old. Trust me, I'm the kind of person, I want to do the right thing no matter what. So a lot of times I have to ask for forgiveness afterwards. It would be nice if I knew what it is that I can and cannot do up front. The other things are really important to me as well, which is why in my training and when I'm working with people, I always talk about the why of things. I think the why of things is a big part of the agile world, at least for those who do a good job with coaching. And the why speaks a lot to the meaning. There's so many training programs, and this drives me nuts, that talk about the how. And there's so many places that I go where I want to talk about the why, and everybody just wants to ask me, what do I do with Jira? I can see Sasha laughing in the green room. And it just drives me nuts. Because if we understand the meaning of what we're doing and we understand why we're doing it, it actually is motivating for us in the VUCA world. Because the people who work in the VUCA world, for the most part, are what we classify as knowledge workers. And they're motivated completely differently. I've talked about it sometimes before. And then the impact that we have. It reminds me, before I see my time is dwindling down, it reminds me of a story that I heard about workers at a nursing home. And the reason that I paid attention to it, believe it or not, fun fact about me, when I was a much younger man, I was a licensed nursing home administrator in the state of Arizona. It was one of my previous careers. And they interviewed people who worked in housekeeping. The interesting thing about the people who worked in housekeeping is that there was a hierarchy of people in nursing homes, which there is. They're generally at the bottom. It's the toughest work. It's the lowest paid work. But here's the thing. They spend more time with the families than probably anyone else, because the nurses are too busy and of course the administrators are too busy, etc. And they asked some of the people about their job, and the people who weren't engaged in their work and who didn't do a very good job, they said, my job is to clean up after people, as if it were a bad thing. But there was a group of people who not the residents, but the families of the residents loved. And these were people who said, my job is to make sure that when the families come in here, that they have a nice, clean place where they can interact with their loved ones. They're providing meaning, not only to their own job, but meaning to the people that they work with. And it was so powerful for me. And that's why, just to kind of wrap this up, the way that we view the world is so important. And I always talk about the way we view the world being important. Because if we understand the meaning of our work and the impact that we have, it changes what we do. It engages us. And that's one of the reasons why I know my meaning and impact in the world. And I know this is why I get so excited about ideas and things like Agile. Anyway, my time is done. I don't want to take too much away from Sasha today.